Cora moved through the pre-dawn chill of the high country with the economy of a creature born to it. Her long, dark brown hair was braided tight against her skull, a practical measure against the snagging willows that lined the game trail. The beige of her collared shirt and the dark brown of her canvas pants were softened with the dust and wood smoke of a year spent alone. She checked the third snare in her line, a simple wire loop near a rabbit run, and found it empty. She reset it with practiced fingers, the cold of the metal a familiar sting. This was the rhythm of her life now, a metronome set by the sun and the seasons, a deliberate turning away from the world below that had taken her father the year before. He had taught her these mountains, the language of track and scat, the patience of the trap line, the quiet dignity of self-reliance. In continuing his rituals, she kept some part of him alive, or at least kept the space his absence had carved out from collapsing in on her. The Wind River Range was not a sanctuary she had found, but one he had built for her over 25 years, and she was now its sole occupant. At her side, Ghost padded in silence, a pale, wolven shadow against the dark timber. He was a creature of the tree line, a hybrid of husky and something wilder that had wandered into her father's camp as a gangly pup and never left. His instincts were sharper than hers, his senses a living perimeter. He was her companion, her early warning system, and the only other heartbeat in her isolated world. They worked the line together, a silent partnership understood in the flick of an ear, the angle of a snout. But for the past 3 mornings, the partnership had been strained. The rhythm was broken. Ghost, who normally ranged ahead, now hung back, his tail low, a low whine vibrating in his chest. He kept looking toward a particular spine of granite that jutted from the mountainside, a feature as familiar and unremarkable to Cora as her own hands. She had tried to urge him on, with a soft word, a click of the tongue, but he would not be moved. His anxiety was a stone dropped into the still pool of her solitude. Today, it was worse. As they approached the granite outcrop, Ghost stopped entirely. The fur along his spine bristled. He lowered his head and let out a sound that was not a whine, but a low, guttural growl directed not at any visible threat, but at the rock itself. He took a few steps forward, then back, his paws churning the thin soil. Cora stopped, her hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle slung over her shoulder. She scanned the trees, the rocks, the sky. Nothing. No scent of bear on the air, no fresh cat tracks, no shadow of an eagle. The threat, whatever it was invisible to her. Ghost crept toward a section of the rock face masked by a thick growth of sarvisberry and juniper, a tangle she'd never had reason to push through. He began to paw at the dirt and loose scree at its base, frantic now, the growl turning into a series of sharp, desperate barks that echoed unnervingly in the morning quiet. He would dig, then look back at her, his pale eyes burning with an intelligence that felt more like communication than instinct. He was not warning her away from something. He was telling her to look. For a year, she had lived by her father's creed, do not disturb what is settled. But the animal's distress was a contagion, a seed of unease that had taken root and was now splitting the foundation of her hard-won peace. Something was wrong. Something was hidden. And the only living thing she trusted was telling her, in the only language it had, that she had to find it. For 2 more days, she tried to maintain her routine. She told herself it was a denning porcupine, a marmot colony, some scent of carrion caught in a fissure that was driving Ghost to distraction. Animals were strange. The mountains were full of small, inexplicable dramas. But her rationalizations were thin against the evidence of the dog's sustained obsession. He stopped eating. He spent his nights not on his usual rug by the cold stove, but whining at the cabin door, looking north toward the granite spine. During the day, he would abandon the trap line and return to the spot, digging until his paws were raw. The sight of him, bloody and exhausted, broke through her inertia. His memory, whatever it was stronger than her desire for peace. The disturbance was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. On the 4th morning, she did not shoulder her rifle. Instead, she took the pry bar from the lean-to and a short-handled spade. The weight of the tools felt alien in her hands, instruments of disruption, not maintenance. She felt a tremor of something like sacrilege, as if she were about to break a rule her father had set down long ago, one she had never been told but had always understood. Ghost trotted ahead of her, his tail giving a single, hopeful wag. He led her directly to the spot, a shallow alcove choked with brush and the accumulated debris of countless seasons. The air was still and cold. While he watched, panting softly, Cora set to work. She hacked away the brittle sarviceberry branches and pulled out the gnarled juniper roots. An hour of labor exposed the rock face, a jumble of granite blocks and weathered scree that looked no different from the rest of the mountainside. But Ghost was insistent, nudging his nose into a narrow gap between two large, flat stones, one resting precariously on the other. It looked natural, a simple trick of geology. Yet as Cora examined it more closely, she saw that the lower stone had been deliberately chiseled flat on its top edge, and the upper stone had a corresponding groove, a crude but effective seal. This was not nature. This was a door. A deep chill, colder than the mountain air, settled over her. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into the seam. At first, the stone refused to budge. It was heavy, settled by years of snow and frost heave. She put her shoulder into it, her boot slipping on the loose dirt. The muscles in her back and arms, conditioned by chopping wood and hauling water, strained against the dead weight. Ghost whined, a high, anxious sound. With a great, groaning scrape, the rock shifted. A puff of stale, cold air, smelling of dust and stone and something else, something like old paper, washed over her. It was the smell of a place sealed from time. She worked the pry bar back and forth, gaining an inch, then another. Finally, with a grating shudder, the top stone slid sideways, revealing a dark, rectangular opening no bigger than a cabin window. It was a hole. A man-made cave. A secret kept by tons of rock and decades of silence. Ghost peered into the darkness but did not enter. He looked at Cora, his duty done, and sat back on his haunches. The rest was up to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, foreign rhythm in the quiet of the morning. Her father had lived and died on this mountain, and in all his years of teaching her its secrets, he had never once mentioned this. The darkness inside the fissure was absolute. Cora retrieved the oil lamp from her pack, her hands unsteady as she struck a match to the wick. The small flame flickered, then grew, casting a warm, trembling light into the opening. She held it forward. The space was small, not a true cave but a deliberately excavated chamber, barely large enough for a man to crouch in. The walls were rough-hewn granite, the floor leveled with packed earth. It was dry. And it was not empty. In the center of the small space sat a single object, a rectangular bundle wrapped in layers of dark, waxed oilcloth and tied securely with leather cord. It was about the size of a small ammunition box. There was nothing else. No tools, no supplies, no bones. Just this carefully preserved package, left alone in the dark. A knot tightened in her stomach. This was not a cache for winter supplies. It was a tomb for a secret. Ghost remained outside, a silent sentinel, as if he understood that this was a threshold only she could cross. She reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold, slightly tacky surface of the oilcloth. The bundle was heavy, solid. She dragged it out into the daylight and set it on the ground. The leather cords were brittle with age, but the knots were tight, intricate, and familiar. They were the same knots her father had used to secure a pack to a horse, the same knots he had taught her as a girl. This was his. There was no longer any doubt. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the wrapped parcel a physical manifestation of a life he had kept hidden from her. The man who had taught her that the truth was in the grain of wood and the clarity of water had buried a part of himself in the dark. She retied the straps of her pack, leaving the tools behind, and lifted the heavy bundle. It felt dense, weighted with more than just its physical contents. On the walk back to the cabin, the sun climbing over the peaks felt distant and cold. The familiar landscape seemed altered, the trees and rocks now imbued with a capacity for concealment she had never before perceived. Inside her small, one-room cabin, the silence was different. It was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. She placed the bundle on the rough-hewn pine table where she and her father had shared 1,000 meals. For a long time, she could not bring herself to open it. To do so felt like a final betrayal of his privacy, an acknowledgement that the simple, honest man she had mourned was not the whole man. But the secret was already out, loosened from the earth by a dog's strange loyalty. Leaving it wrapped would not make it untrue. With a deep breath, she took her skinning knife and carefully sliced through the aged leather cords. They fell away with a dry snap. She unfolded the layers of oilcloth. The wax had done its job. The contents were perfectly preserved, untouched by moisture or time. There were 3 items. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with a maker's mark she didn't recognize. A thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a blob of dark red wax. And nestled between them, a silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished almost to black. She picked up the locket first. It was heavier than it looked. Her thumb found the small clasp and pressed. It sprang open. The face that looked back at her was not her mother's. She had seen photos of her mother, a woman with a wide, open face and hair the color of straw, who had died when Cora was too young to remember. This woman was different. Younger, with dark, intense eyes and a small, determined mouth. A stranger. Cora closed the locket with a click, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The first piece of her father's hidden life was a woman she had never seen, and the questions this single object raised were a chasm opening at her feet. She set the locket aside, the unfamiliar face a silent accusation on the table. Her hand went to the journal. The leather was supple, the pages edged in gilt. It was the journal of a man who valued such things, not the sort of practical logbook a trapper would keep. Her father, Thomas, had been a man of few words and fewer possessions. He read almanacs and worn paperback novels, not fine-bound books. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was his, the same precise, slightly slanted script from the notes he'd sometimes leave her about a coming storm or a shift in the elk herds. But the words themselves belonged to a stranger. The entry was dated 26 years ago, a month before she was born. It did not begin with observations about the weather or the price of furs. It began with a name. My name is Daniel Porter. I was a surveyor for the state of Wyoming. Today, that man ceases to exist. Cora read the sentence again. And again. Daniel Porter. Not Thomas. A surveyor, not a trapper. The words dismantled her reality piece by piece. She turned the pages, her breath catching in her throat. The journal was not a diary of daily events, but a long, confessional letter addressed to no one. It spoke of a town, Lander, 100 miles to the south. It spoke of a job surveying a vast tract of land owned by a powerful ranching family, the Finches. It spoke of discovering that the original survey markers, the ones that established the Finch property lines, had been moved. The fraud was immense, hiding a rich vein of mineral deposits on what should have been public land. Daniel Porter, her father, had documented the deception, creating a new, true map. But before he could file it, he was discovered. The journal was sparse on the details of the confrontation, but it spoke of threats, of a man named Alastair Finch, a man with the wealth and influence to make a problem like a state surveyor disappear. He gave me a choice, her father had written. The map, or my life. But he did not know about the girl. The girl? The woman in the locket. The journal mentioned her name just once, Elena. It spoke of a promise he had made to her. He had to run, not just to save himself, but to protect something he carried for her. I have the original deeds and her boy's birthright. Finch can have the rocks and the dust. I will not let him have the boy. The boy. Not a girl. Cora's mind reeled. The journal ended there, the last half of the book empty. The final entry was a hurried scrawl. Finch knows. I have to go. I will hide this where only a true memory can find it. I will become a ghost in the high timber. It is the only way to keep the promise. He had not been hiding from the world. He had been hiding from Alastair Finch. He had not chosen solitude. It had been forced upon him as the price of protecting someone. The room felt small, airless. Cora stood up and walked to the open door, breathing in the sharp, clean air, but it did not clear her head. Ghost whined at her feet, pressing his head against her leg. She looked down at the envelope on the table, its red wax seal still unbroken. Her boy's birthright. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. She broke the seal. Inside were several folded documents, stiff with age. The first was a series of official deeds for parcels of land, not in the mountains, but in the rich valley south of Lander. The name on the deeds was not Alastair Finch. It was a name she had never heard, Mateo Reyes. The second document was a birth certificate. It was for a boy, also named Mateo Reyes, born 26 years ago. The mother's name was Elena Reyes. The father's name was listed as Daniel Porter. A boy. Born a month before her. It took a long moment for the pieces to connect, for the impossible truth to form. Her father had a son. A son she never knew existed. And then she looked at her own birth certificate, the worn copy she kept in a small tin box with her mother's photograph. She pulled it out. The date of birth was a month after the boy, Mateo's. The place of birth was listed simply as Fremont County. The mother's name was Sarah, the woman with the straw-colored hair. The father's name was Thomas, the trapper. A lie? Her entire life, her very name, was a lie. He had hidden the boy's identity by creating a new one. For her. He had split his life in two, creating a ghost child, a daughter in the wilderness, to protect his real child, a son in the world below. The locket, the journal, the deeds, they were not her inheritance. They were a message, a final duty he had left for her to complete. The mountains, which had always been her shelter, now felt like a cage. The solitude she had cultivated as a way to honor her father's memory was, she now understood, the very architecture of his deception. He had built this life for her not just to teach her independence, but to keep her separate, to keep her from ever asking questions, from ever looking south. Every lesson, every skill, every shared silence was part of the construction of a false identity meant to protect a truth she was never supposed to find. But he had underestimated the wild memory of an animal, and the stubborn loyalty of a daughter. The discovery of the cave had not brought her closer to him, it had revealed an immense distance, a chasm of secrets that spanned her entire life. To honor him now meant something different. It meant leaving the cage. It meant finishing the work he had started. It meant understanding the sacrifice by confronting the man who had caused it. She stood for a long time, the two birth certificates in her hand, one for a boy named Mateo, one for a girl who didn't exist. She was the ghost child. A fiction created to shield the real heir. The anger she expected to feel did not come. In its place was a profound and heavy sorrow, and a quiet, burning urgency. Her father had spent 25 years as a ghost. He had given up his name, his past, his other son, to keep a promise. She owed it to him, and to the unknown woman in the locket, to see that promise through. She had to go to Lander. She had to find out what happened to Elena and her son, Mateo. She had to face Alastair Finch, or whatever remained of his legacy. The path forward was no longer a trail through the timber, it was a road leading south, into a past that was not her own but was now her responsibility. Packing was a simple, mechanical act. She moved through the cabin, gathering the few things she would need, a bedroll, a small supply of dried meat and hardtack, her father's old compass, and the oilcloth bundle. She put the journal, the deeds, and the locket into her leather satchel, the weight of them a constant reminder of her purpose. She left the snares in her trap line sprung. She banked the fire in the stove, leaving the cabin cold and empty, a museum of a life that was no longer hers. As she saddled her horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, Ghost watched her, his head cocked. He seemed to understand. When she mounted, he did not run for the timber but fell into place beside the horse's shoulder, ready for the journey. They descended from the high pass at dawn, leaving the granite peaks and the silent pines behind. The world opened up below her, a vast, rolling expanse of sagebrush and dry plains under a pale, endless sky. For the first time in her life, she felt the exposure of open country. The wind carried new scents of dust and distance. Every mile south was a mile deeper into her father's past, a landscape of secrets she was now compelled to cross. The journey took 4 days. The high-altitude silence of the wind rivers gave way to the low hum of the plains, the rush of wind through dry grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the rumble of a passing truck on a gravel road that ran parallel to her own slower path. She felt like a traveler from another time, a relic of the wilderness moving through a world that had forgotten it. On the 3rd day, low on water, she guided her horse toward a distant, shimmering point of light that resolved into the rusted metal roof of a trading post. It was a long, low building with a sagging porch and a single gas pump out front, an outpost of civilization clinging to the edge of the vast emptiness. She tied the gelding to a hitching rail and pushed open the door, a bell jingling overhead. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, old leather, and coffee. An old man with a face like a dried apple sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up at her over his spectacles, his eyes taking in her worn clothes, the sheathed knife on her belt, the quiet wolf dog that stood just inside the doorway. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Just need to fill my canteens, if you don't mind." "I can pay for the water," Cora said. Her own voice sounded strange, unused to casual conversation. "Water's free for travelers," the man said, gesturing with a thumb toward a spigot behind the counter. "Where you headed, looking like you just stepped out of 1880. Cora hesitated. Her father had taught her to be guarded, to offer nothing. But her father had also been living a lie. "South. To Lander." The old man grunted. "Lander. Used to be something. Now it's just a place people pass through on their way to Jackson." He folded his newspaper. "You got business there?" A direct question. She gave a partial truth. "Family business. Looking into some old property records." From a long time ago she filled her canteens, the silence stretching between them. She knew she needed more than water. She needed a thread to pull. "I'm looking for information on a family named Finch." The old man's expression sharpened. The friendly curiosity vanished, replaced by a guarded stillness. "Finch? Now that's a name I haven't heard spoken with any kindness in a long time." "Which one you mean?" The old man, Alistair? Or the son? "The father, I suppose." "Alistair." The shopkeeper leaned forward, his voice dropping. Alistair Finch was king of this part of the county for 30 years. Owned more land than God. Mean as a gut-shot grizzly, and twice as greedy. He died about 10 years back. Lost most of his fortune before the end, though. Big scandal. Something about his land claims being fraudulent. Cost him everything. He paused, studying her. It all came to light because of a surveyor who went missing years before. Man hired by the state. They said he ran off with the proof, but his report finally turned up somehow. Wrecked the Finch name for good. Cora's heart was pounding. It was real. The journal was real. "What happened to the surveyor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Disappeared," the old man said, shrugging. Most folks figured Finch had him killed and buried somewhere out in the sage. The man's wife and kid vanished right after. A woman named Elena Reyes and her boy. Sweet woman. Used to buy groceries here. She told me once her husband was a good man doing a dangerous job. Then one day, they were just gone. Sheriff looked for them, but it was a cold trail. Like they just evaporated. He shook his head slowly. The son, though, the new Alistair. He's a different animal. A lawyer. Spends all his time in Cheyenne, trying to get the state to overturn the ruling, trying to reclaim his father's stolen legacy, he calls it. Some poisons get passed down, I guess. He stared at her, a long, calculating look. Why is a girl from the high country asking about a feud that's 30 years dead? Cora simply met his gaze, the deeds and the journal a heavy weight in her satchel. The surveyor, she said softly. He was my father. The old man's jaw went slack. He looked from her to Ghost and back again. The story she represented, a ghost story he'd been telling for decades, had just walked through his door. He slowly pushed a dusty bag of jerky across the counter. "On the house," he said, his voice thick with a new respect. "You be careful, Inlander. A son trying to reclaim his father's name can be more dangerous than the old man ever was." Lander was larger and louder than Cora had anticipated. The town was a grid of paved streets and brick buildings nestled in a cottonwood-lined river valley. After a life of granite and pine, the geometry of it felt confining, the noise of cars and people a constant, low-grade assault. Ghost stayed close, his head low, as unnerved as she was by the press of civilization. She found a room in a small, unassuming inn at the edge of town, paying with one of the few worn bills her father had left. The room was clean, anonymous, with a window that looked out onto an alley. It felt temporary, a place to anchor herself before stepping fully into the past. The next morning, she left Ghost in the room with a bowl of water and a command to stay, and walked to the Fremont County Courthouse. It was an imposing stone building, its steps worn smooth by generations of petitioners and defendants. Inside, the air smelled of floor polish and old paper. She found the county clerk's office and a woman sitting behind a high counter, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stamped a stack of documents. She had graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore practical, wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" the woman asked without looking up. Her nameplate read Maeve O'Connell, County Clerk. "I hope so," Cora said. "I need to look at some old property records. Plat maps and deeds from the late 1970s and early 80s. Maeve finally looked up, her gaze sharp and intelligent. She took in Cora's appearance, the quiet intensity in her eyes. It was not the usual request. "That's archive material. Most of it's not digitized. What tract are you interested in?" Cora took a breath. "Land formerly owned by Alastair Finch. Specifically, the parcels bordering Bureau of Land Management territory to the north." She decided to use the name that connected her to the truth, the name on the deeds. "My name is Reyes. I believe my family may have had a claim." Maeve's pen stopped moving. She took off her glasses and polished them slowly with a cloth. The name had registered. "Reyes," she repeated, her voice neutral. "That's a name connected to the Finch case." The surveyor's family. She put her glasses back on and studied Cora with renewed interest. The official record is complex. The original surveyor, Daniel Porter, his findings were suppressed for years. His common-law wife, Elena Reyes, and their son disappeared. The case was reopened about a decade ago when an anonymous source delivered Porter's original field notes and the corrected map to the state attorney's office. "Anonymous source?" Cora asked. "A package left with a law firm in Cheyenne. No return address," Maeve said. It was enough to launch a new investigation, which ultimately stripped the Finch estate of the contested land. The mineral rights reverted to the state. She leaned forward slightly. The current Alastair Finch, the son, has a standing petition to have that ruling overturned. He claims that the new evidence was a fabrication. He's been a thorn in this office's side for years. Maeve stood up. "The archives are in the basement. It's a mess down there, but if you know what you're looking for, you might find it. Come on." She led Cora through a heavy door and down a flight of echoing concrete stairs into a vast, dimly lit basement filled with rows upon rows of metal shelves. The air was cool and dry, thick with the scent of aging paper. "The Fremont County survey maps are over here," Maeve said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "If you're a Reyes, you might find what you're looking for. Or you might just find more trouble." For the next several hours, the two women worked in the dusty silence, pulling out heavy books of maps and boxes of brittle deeds, laying the groundwork for a truth that had been buried for a generation. Under Maeve's expert guidance, the story buried in the archives began to surface. They unrolled the official survey plat filed by Alastair Finch's company in 1978. It was a clean, professionally drafted map. Then Maeve located a corresponding box of field notes, and the discrepancy was immediate. The handwritten coordinates in the surveyor's log, the raw data, did not match the lines drawn on the final map. The fraud was not subtle, it was brazen. Entire sections had been shifted by a quarter-mile, a simple pen stroke that moved $1 billion worth of Trona deposits from public land onto Finch Ranch. "This is what Daniel Porter must have found," Maeve murmured, her finger tracing the conflicting numbers. "He would have had to resurvey the entire tract to prove it." Then, from a dusty box labeled "A Miscellaneous Correspondence," Cora found it, a thin file containing carbon copies of letters from her father, Daniel Porter, to the State Land Board. The first was a formal request to resurvey the Finch tract due to suspected irregularities. The second, dated 2 months later, was more urgent, stating he had found incontrovertible proof of deliberate and systemic fraud and would be delivering his report and a corrected map in person. It was the last letter in the file. He never made it to Cheyenne. So he had the proof, Cora said, her voice quiet. The corrected map. The one that turned up 10 years ago. She thought of her father, a quiet man who enjoyed fixing things, applying that same methodical patience to unraveling a massive crime. He wasn't a hero in a fight, he was a man who believed in true lines. And Alastair Finch knew it, Maeve added, her expression grim. "Which is why you and your mother disappeared." "She wasn't my mother," Cora said, the words tasting strange. "Her name was Elena Reyes. Her son was Mateo. My father hid them, and then he created me, a new daughter, a new name, and vanished into the mountains to keep us all safe." She opened her satchel and laid the contents on the dusty table, the journal, the tarnished locket, and the deeds her father had hidden. Maeve stared at the items, her professional detachment giving way to awe. She picked up one of the deeds, made out to Mateo Reyes. "These are the original deeds to the homestead Elena's family owned," she whispered. "Finch had them illegally condemned and absorbed them into his ranch after she and Porter disappeared. He claimed they had abandoned the property. But with these, the claim was never abandoned. It was stolen." Maeve looked at Cora, her eyes wide with the implications. "Cora, do you understand what you have? This isn't just a historical record. This is evidence. The journal, these deeds, this proves the intent. It's the one thing the state could never definitively prove, that Alastair Finch didn't just benefit from a mistake, he actively threatened a state official and stole this land to cover his tracks." The weight of the oilcloth bundle suddenly felt immense. It was not just a story, it was a weapon. As they were packing the documents away, a man appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the dusty archive. He had a smooth, handsome face, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I was told at the front desk that someone was reviewing my family's files. I'm Alastair Finch." The name hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. This was him. The son. The man trying to reclaim a legacy of theft. He walked toward them, his expensive shoes silent on the concrete floor. His gaze swept over the table, noting the old maps and the open satchel, before settling on Cora. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending a hand. "You must be the one asking questions." Cora did not take his hand. She simply stood, her body tensed, the presence of Ghost a phantomache at her side. Maeve stepped slightly in front of her. "This is a public archive, Mr. Finch. The records are open to anyone." Finch's smile tightened. "Of course. I'm a great believer in transparency. In fact, that's why I'm here. It seems a great injustice was done to my father, based on documents of questionable origin." He looked directly at Cora, his eyes boring into her. "My father was a builder. He created an empire from dust. But he was betrayed by a hired surveyor, a man named Porter who tried to blackmail him. When my father refused, Porter stole valuable papers and fled. He was a common thief. He delivered the lines as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times, a polished narrative of victimhood. I've spent the last decade trying to clear his name. I heard someone new was in town, a woman with a story. I was hoping we could help each other. Perhaps you found something that belongs to my family. Those deeds, for instance." His eyes flickered to her satchel. "I would be willing to compensate you for their return. To put this whole unfortunate business behind us." His voice was smooth, persuasive, the voice of a man used to getting what he wanted. He was offering her a deal, a quiet transaction to bury the truth for good. He was reframing her father as a criminal, a thief. For a dizzying moment, seeing his confidence, his apparent sincerity, a sliver of doubt entered Cora's mind. What if her father's journal was not the whole truth? What if he had been more complicated, more compromised, than she knew? The false narrative was powerful, designed to prey on uncertainty. But then she thought of the locket with Elena's face, the desperate final entry in the journal, the 25 years her father had spent as a ghost in the mountains. He had not run toward fortune, he had run away from it. "They don't belong to you," Cora said, her voice low and steady. "They belong to Mateo Reyes." Finch's pleasant mask twitched. For the first time, a flicker of cold fury showed in his eyes. "The boy is gone. The mother is gone. Their claims are dust. All that is left is you, a ghost from the past, and a bag of worthless paper. Give them to me." It was no longer a request. It was a demand. "Let's not make this difficult." The confrontation in the archive had been a prelude. Finch did not press the matter further in front of Maeve, instead offering a tight, final smile and a parting shot. "Think about my offer. It's more than a thief's daughter deserves." He left them in the echoing silence of the basement. Maeve let out a long, slow breath. "The old man had thugs," she said. "The son has lawyers and a silver tongue. I'm not sure which is more dangerous. You need to be careful, Cora. He knows you have the journal now. He won't let it go." That evening, Cora felt the walls of the small inn room closing in. The town, which had seemed merely loud, now felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She sat on the edge of the bed, the satchel beside her, Ghost's head resting on her knee. The dog was tense, his ears twitching at every sound from the street below. He knew, as she did, that the hunt had been joined. Finch's performance had been chillingly effective, a man so convinced of his inherited grievance that he had rewritten history to suit it. He was not just after the land, he was after the validation of his father's crimes. The next day, following a new line of inquiry suggested by Maeve, Cora went to the town's small Catholic church. The old man at the trading post had mentioned Elena was devout. Maeve had theorized that if she had fled, she might have sought help from the church. The parish priest was young, too young to remember the 70s, but he dutifully searched the old baptismal and confirmation records. There was no Mateo Reyes. No Elena. It was another dead end. Discouraged, she left the church and began walking back toward the inn, taking a quieter side street lined with old warehouses. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows. A car, a sleek black sedan, pulled up alongside her. Alistair Finch was behind the wheel. He rolled down the passenger window. "Get in," he said. There was no pretense of civility now. His face was a hard mask of impatience. "We're going to have a conversation." Cora kept walking. "We have nothing to talk about." The car door opened and he got out, blocking her path. He was taller than he had seemed in the basement, his expensive suit doing little to hide the solid frame beneath. "You don't get it, do you? You are a loose end. A ghost my father should have dealt with permanently. He was too soft. I don't make the same mistakes." He glanced around the empty street. "I have spent millions of dollars and 10 years of my life fighting to restore my family's honor. I will not let the daughter of a dead thief undo all of it with a book of lies." He lunged for her satchel. The movement was sudden, vicious. Cora, conditioned by a life of physical reaction, sidestepped, pulling the satchel away. But he was strong, his hand clamping down on the leather strap. A tug-of-war began in the middle of the deserted street, a desperate struggle over a bag of paper that held the weight of 2 families, 2 histories. He was stronger than her, and he began to pull her off balance. "Give it to me," he snarled, his face contorted with a rage that was generations old. In that instant, a blur of pale fur erupted from the alley behind the warehouse. Ghost, who had somehow slipped out of the inn room, moved with a speed and silence that was utterly wild. He did not bark. He did not growl. There was only the sound of his body hitting Finch's side like a sack of sand and the sickening tear of fabric and flesh. Finch screamed, a high, shocked sound of pain and surprise, as he was thrown to the ground. Ghost was on him, not with the playful nip of a dog, but with the focused, disabling attack of a wolf. His jaws locked onto Finch's arm, the one that had been grabbing for the satchel. Finch thrashed, trying to beat the animal off, but Ghost held fast, his body low, his muscles corded. The attack was swift, precise, and over in seconds. As soon as Finch was down and the threat to Cora was neutralized, Ghost released his grip. He backed away, his lips curled back to show bloody teeth, a low rumble in his chest. Finch lay on the ground, clutching his arm, his suit ruined, his face pale with shock and pain. The inherited violence had finally manifested, and it had been met with a violence that was older, more elemental. Cora stood over him, breathing heavily, the satchel clutched to her chest. Her first instinct was to run, to grab Ghost and disappear back into the safety of the wilderness. It was what her father had done. But as she looked at the man whimpering on the ground, at the evidence of his crime now written on his own body, she knew that running was not her path. That was his story. Hers would be different. She pulled Ghost back with a quiet command, then turned and walked, not toward the mountains, but toward the imposing stone courthouse and the sheriff's office within. The aftermath was a blur of official procedure, a world Cora had only ever known from the outside. The sheriff, a weary man named Hatcher, listened to her story with weary skepticism until she laid the journal, the deeds, and the locket on his desk. He listened to Finch sputtering claims of being attacked by a wild animal while he was trying to reason with her. But the evidence was hard to ignore, the bite marks on Finch's arm, the location on a deserted street, the testimony of Maeve O'Connell about the confrontation in the archives, and the weight of the documents themselves. Finch was charged with assault, and his attempt to steal the satchel triggered a deeper investigation by the state attorney's office, which had been waiting for a new crack in the Finch case for years. The journal of Daniel Porter, authenticated by experts, became sworn testimony from the grave. The deeds in the name of Mateo Reyes became the basis for a new legal challenge, not just to reclaim the stolen homestead, but to unravel the entire web of fraud. Cora did not stay in Lander to see it all unfold. Her part was done. She had delivered the message her father had died protecting. Before she left, she met with Maeve one last time. "What will you do now?" Maeve asked. "There's one more thing," Cora said. "Elena and Mateo Reyes. They disappeared. I need to know what happened to them." Maeve, using her network of historians and record keepers across the state, made some calls. The answer came 2 days later, not from a public record, but from the quiet archives of a Catholic charity in Colorado. After fleeing Lander, Elena Reyes, fearing for her son's life, had sought their help. They had given her a new name and passage to a new life, far from Wyoming, with distant relatives in a place where the name Finch meant nothing. A small town in coastal Oregon. There was a record of a boy, his name changed, growing up there. He was alive. He was safe. Her father's promise had been kept. He had not abandoned his son, he had saved him. With that final piece of knowledge, the weight on Cora's shoulders finally eased. She worked with Maeve and a pro bono lawyer to have her father's story officially recorded. Daniel Porter was posthumously cleared of any wrongdoing, his name entered into the county record as the man whose integrity had exposed the Finch conspiracy. The land stolen from the Reyes family was, after a protracted legal battle funded by the state's Victim Compensation Fund, restored to its rightful heir, Mateo, the man in Oregon who had yet to learn the full story of the father he never knew. Cora asked for nothing for herself. Her inheritance was not land or money, it was the truth. Before leaving town, she used the last of her father's money to place a simple bronze plaque at the trailhead leading up into the Wind River Range. It read, "Daniel Porter. A quiet man of true lines." It was a public honor for a private courage. Her journey was over. She saddled her gelding, Ghost trotting faithfully beside her, and turned back toward the high peaks. The mountains no longer felt like a cage. They were home. A home she had left to reclaim her father's name and, in doing so, had finally found her own. The solitude that awaited her was not one of hiding, but of peace. An earned peace, settled and complete, under the silent watch of the granite spires.